Hello, everybody, and welcome to Wrestling with Statistics, the only show that takes the unique look of looking at the world of professional wrestling through the lens of stats and analytics and everything in between. I am your host this week, Ryan Neitzey, and with me, as always, is Craig Leask from Pro Wrestling Musings. How are you doing, Craig?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. Bit of a traumatic week for me. I lost the ability to walk, which was very fun.
Whoa, what?
I've maybe been a little dramatic there. I was just walking back from the shop with my shopping, and then I got this like splitting pain in my foot. Start like taking my shoes off, looking for a nail that I must have stood on. Can't find anything. Hobbling around for 2 or 3 days. Went to the podiatrist, and he pulled out a splinter that was so big I couldn't even see it. And now everything is good. So yeah, there's
God.
your kind of random response to the how is your week podcast opening question.
Oh my God, are you okay? I gotta ask.
Oh, it was like a magic trick. I couldn't put any weight on it. The guy took out what he said was a splinter. I'm taking Matt's word because I could barely see it, and it was absolutely perfect. It's the weird, like, you know, when you get a splinter in your finger and it's like, you know, it's a tiny bit sore. Yeah, don't get one in your foot.
Oh my God. Well, I'm glad it sounds like you're doing okay. Are you able to, like, now that the splinter's out, able to sort of walk normally, or is it still kind of just like sore?
No, it's like it's like if you get a splinter in your finger, it's not a big deal. It was just bizarre that like it was as if there was like, you know, a big chunk of metal or something. It was foot chat. That's how you start a good podcast, right?
I would say yes. I mean, yeah, most weeks we talk about how we don't have something coming in, and that was, I think, the perfect thing to come in with. You didn't tell me this all week, and now I'm just like, I'm flustered. I'm glad you're doing better. I'm glad it was just a splinter and nothing worse, my man.
Yes, I'd Google diagnosed myself as having like torn a tendon or something.
Oh my God. Well, you can never Google diagnose yourself. Never go to WebMD. You're just gonna think you have like foot cancer or something.
Yes. Foot cancer.
And for someone that has been kindly quiet during the foot talk, we have a special guest on today's episode. As you can probably read in the title of this podcast episode, we have a special guest this week. It is none other than at UTTRob on Twitter. Rob, how are you doing, my man?
I'm doing really well. I thought I was doing okay, but compared to Craig's adventure, I'm doing amazing. You know,
I'm just pleased you're still here after that opening.
Well, I think it's good that things like that happen because, you know, as men, we often get looked down on for, you know, having man flu, that kind of thing. So, you know, I think it's really important that we can be debilitated by a tiny splinter. You know, we just need to get out there for people to understand how hard it is to be a man.
Well, yes, I guess this is all true. Rob, how are you doing, my friend? I mean, first off, how's your foot? Second off, how's your week been?
But both feet are fine. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I say that now. I've not checked for any tiny splinters around the house. Although I keep actually getting a splinter in the same place on my wrist. Sort of working from home and the table that I've got. I think there's like just a little nick in it, sort of thing. So about 4 times I've had a splinter in the same place. But
what is happening? Yeah. What is happening to you two? Why are you guys getting splinters? Where are you? Are you like in log cabins? Like, where are you getting all these splinters from?
Yeah, it's still the 12th century in Britain. So
oh, okay, there we go. That makes sense. Oh my gosh. Well, thanks for coming on, Rob. We greatly appreciate you coming on to the show. You know, we saw you've been doing a bunch of like stats and stuff. We sort of talking with you in the DMs and through Twitter and whatnot, sort of because you've been doing a bunch of stats and whatnot on Twitter as well. So we wanted to bring you on, of course, to talk about everything, and wanted to get your mind into, peek into your mind to see what you got on this show. But yeah, I mean, first off, I want to ask you, where did all this interest from like stats and analytics come from? Is that just something that you picked up on the side? Is it something of a job? Where did it all start?
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been interested in maths. My much more mathematical than my ability with the English language or whatever, as you've probably seen from my spelling mistakes and graphs and what. I've always related more to numbers. Actually, I do put a lot about TV ratings and stuff on Twitter, and that is because I'm really interested in stats. And I can remember at A level actually did a project on TV ratings, sort of comparing TV ratings to the sort of audience reception of a program. So you'd get this, the website where people would upload their review, in terms of a number between 1 and 10, and compare that to the TV rating. And even at that point, it's sort of, you could see that there's not much relationship between commercial success and the hardcore fan base's appreciation of the product, if that makes sense.
Well, that's really kind of apt and timely for the kind of discourse being fired around on Twitter every Thursday.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, and because of being able, the data I could find at the time, it was actually on Star Trek.
All right.
Because there was just this really, really nice data set online that sort of had, loads of information about all the episodes and good note, because if you get reviews that only like 4 people have filled in, then it's not really that meaningful, because you might have got 4 people that put 10, whereas if you get 1,000 people, it's probably a lot more reliable as to what the community thought of it. So it just panned out that was the data was in a better state to do that. But yeah, I think I would imagine if you can make that assumption about Star Trek, you can easily make that assumption about wrestling, about anything, really. I would think it'd be the same.
I think that makes sense. I mean, yeah, and especially like, with everything that's happened in the business of wrestling, I think there's something to tracking the ratings to sort of see how the business is doing. But of course, when you have the demo god front and center in that, definitely creates a lot of discourse online, and I'm glad they're sort of tracking that stuff.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I just put a tweet out this week that for all that AEW is perceived as, and they are doing better in the 18 to 49 demo, actually, they still had more people watching in the plus 50 demo than the 18 to 49. And when you look at the demos, that's a percentage of the audience that's watching at that time. And there's actually more. So even though the number mathematically was higher, there tends to normally be more people in the 50 plus demo watching anyway. So, 10% in both is actually more people in the plus 50. So the majority of the AEW audience is actually outside the demo. And I think that's something that kind of gets slept on in the debate because they're just comparing AEW to each other. I think the other thing that's kind of interests me, we've gone a long way from my interest in stats here, but the other thing that interests me is people see that number and think that's the only thing that people are paying for advertising for in the demo. But you watch a lot of TV and you see a lot of adverts for, knee braces and glasses and travel agents that don't do the internet and stuff. And clearly there is advertising out there that is focused at the over 50 demo. So it would be quite interesting to look at that payoff to say, well, if they pay a certain percentage less for that advertising, you could still make more money, even though you've got a lower demo in the 18 to 49, because you're offsetting it with more views at a lower rate in the over 50. Which, your Meltzers and your Alvarez's won't discuss that because all they want to discuss is that headline number because that fits their agenda.
Yeah, there's something to say about how, like you said, with the plus 50 demo, there's something to say that there's most wrestling fans are in that 50 plus. I wonder why that. I mean, obviously, when you're talking like how the data is collected, you're talking from, people that have the boxes, who potentially own it. I assume that are 50 plus in general, but so I wonder like maybe there's some sort of essay that needs to be written about why wrestling is currently more for 50 plus year olds than the younger crowd.
Is that is the viewing habits argument coming in there?
I think there is a good point there about there is viewing habits that older people more than likely could be watching it live, while younger people understand that they can just watch it later down the line. But which is I think is a very solid point. Rob, I wanted to ask you another question. We're talking about wrestling. What was I obviously you've probably been watching wrestling for a very long time. What was the moment that you sort of fell in love with wrestling? Not necessarily. It could be obviously your favorite match, whatever. But what was the moment that you watched that you knew, like, hey, this is something I want to watch for the rest of my life?
Well, just to answer your previous question, just for context, yes, I
Of
do
course.
work I do work in stats and modelling now, so yes, that is my career. Right. So anyway, in terms of getting into wrestling, I was sort of born into a family that watched wrestling, especially my grandparents, and World of Sport was kind of ubiquitous in Britain when it was on originally. So a vast amount of the population watched it, so you couldn't kind of miss it. So I think the first thing that sort of resonated with me in terms of early memories or whatever was the Giant Haystacks Big Daddy feud, which a lot of people will look at now and think, oh God, the match was awful. And yes, the match was awful. But they captured the nation's imagination with the feud, and a third of the population watched it. So I would argue, if you've got wrestling and the point of wrestling is to make money, essentially, that did a lot better job than something that you could say, well, this is a 6-star match or whatever, that might not necessarily have a story behind it, or really sort of captured the audience's imagination. So you kind of have that dichotomy with wrestling. But yeah, I mean, obviously that was iconic.
Sounds like the British equivalent of Hogan Andre. It's not a great match, but it is the one that is spoken about and captured said imagination.
Well, I think to a certain extent, you're always going to have the hardcore fans like ourselves watching, and we'll go through the peaks and troughs and take the rough with the smooth sort of thing. I think it's when you can start engaging the rest of the audience and bringing people in. I think that's your metric of it doing well. So it's like I said, it's exactly what I said about Star Trek. That if people don't necessarily like it, that doesn't mean there's less people watching. Because that might actually be meaning something to someone else who's not in that hardcore fan base.
You mentioned Star Trek real quickly. I just want to ask, who's your favorite captain?
Well, I'd be slightly biased but I'd have to say Patrick Stewart, who's a fellow Huddersfield Town fan and chairman of the club. And I've seen at games a few times.
Is he?
Yes,
right.
yes.
I didn't know that. All right.
Yes, he grew up in Mirfield, which is sort of one of the suburbs of Huddersfield.
What is it about Huddersfield that both you and Patrick Stewart love?
in terms of the football team, I don't know. I don't think you. I think love's probably a good description, because in terms of football, I don't think you would make a logical decision looking back to follow the club that you fell in love with, because I did actually see a study once where the benefits that you gain from being a football fan are far outweighed by the negatives. So you have these few fleeting moments of joy when the club's doing successful, and then you have 2 seasons worth of relegation battles, as we've had in a row, to sort of offset massively that high. So I think it is an emotional decision rather than a logical one.
I mean, I guess that makes sense. Obviously, in America, we're not football / soccer, American soccer crazy here. We're more American football crazy. I don't know what it's like to grow up loving a team, because when it comes to American sports, it's just sort of at least for the professional side, you just sort of like a athlete, and then you just follow their career pretty much.
And I don't know, whereabouts do you live in America, Brian?
That I don't know where America differs on everything in the world. I mean, there's so many aspects of America.
I was just going to say, I've been watching quite a lot of stuff about the Portland Timbers,
Okay.
And they, the Portland and Seattle,
Hmm.
from what I can tell, kind of have a much more sort of British attitude towards the football. They've got incredibly sort of hardcore fans. The chanting. I mean, Portland's insane. When they score a goal, they have this huge log that a guy with a chainsaw shaves a bit off, and they hand it round the crowd and stuff.
What?
So you have to watch it. It's absolutely insane. Anyone who says Americans don't get football, watch about the Portland Timbers, and their main rivals, Seattle, are just as crazy in the
Oh my
other
God.
direction. So, yeah, that's definitely worth checking out. But yeah, and I think part of it is that the clubs in Britain are a lot closer to each other, so you've got that rivalry, whereas it's often quite a long way between, like if it's Dallas to San Francisco, that's like a continent away for us, sort of thing.
There's also like more local teams, like people tend to support the team of the town or the city that they grew up in. So like there's a 92 team like league pyramid in England. So like people, there's all these teams that people live closer to. Whereas I don't think that that's the case with American football, unless that's where college football comes into it.
I think college football definitely has a little bit of that. And college football also has sort of that club vibe where
Mm,
you are rooting for the school.
yeah,
Essentially the school. You're rooting for these sort of teams where, because you know that, whether it be 2, 3, 4 years later, whoever your favorite wide receiver was, the guys that catch the footballs, um, they're going off into the NFL. So you're not going to see them. You're sort of in a way forced to uh, enjoy the club, enjoy the team, enjoy the school there in a weird way.
and I'm guessing that's why people tend to follow players rather than teams.
Yeah, because you sort of fall in love with one
Yeah.
player and then
Okay.
go that way. And that's why also a lot of the betrayal happens. I guess that also probably happens in a lot of the football clubs in Europe, where there is that level of betrayal where one person is like, you know what, I'm going to this team. And you're like, what do you mean you're going to this team? You're our guy.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes pigs' heads get thrown onto football pitches in those situations.
I mean, it's not as like fun as like sawing a log, but I mean I guess that's pretty cool.
I don't think the separation happens there and then.
Oh, that'd be awful. That would be so awful. Oh my god, man, what a turn. Oh man, I've lost my train of thought just thinking about that now. Yeah. Well, let's just talk about stats. How about that? Let's just go into the stats talk. We the previous week. Oh my, I'm just thinking about Pig's Head now. Oh my gosh. Craig,
Apologies.
help me out here. Craig, help me out here.
So we're gonna start looking at one match. We'll go for the stats and then maybe pick out bits that we think are interesting in the storytelling of the match. So the one that we're going to look at this week is John Moxley versus Brian Cage. Dan, the excellence of procrastination on Twitter, is going to be writing this up and popping it up on the website. But as a preview to that, so John Moxley versus Brian Cage. It was a very interesting match. It's the first time that we've really seen Brian Cage in a match that wasn't just a proper dominant squash. Surprisingly, Moxley, 59% of the offense won the strike battle. Brian Cage opting to go for big grapples, 12-2 in favor of him, which saw Moxley take it to the sky at times, 2 dives, and 87 seconds of submission, which ultimately was the best strategy, as that's what led to the win. When we're looking at the flow of offense, Brian Cage only really kind of had 2 kind of big parts of dominance within the match. Moxley, kind of 3 or 4 aspects where he was in control. And if you look at the trend lines there, you can see that Brian Cage started off hotter than Moxley, and they kind of crisscross almost in the middle. So the match, and that's kind of confirmed by the 5-minute period breakdown, where we see Brian Cage in the ascendancy for the first half of the match, and then Jon Moxley taking control with the use of submissions. And again, when we move on to looking at the comparison of the way that the two wrestlers performed, you can see the big grapples advantage from Brian Cage, but then the kind of dwarfing, the doubling of the submission seconds used by Jon Moxley to pick up the win. Passing over to you guys, what exactly jumps out? How do the stats kind of tell the story of the match? What kind of reads as significant from that?
I think they were telling the story with the arm. Moxley had sort of cut that promo on the run-in about tearing his bicep off the bone, sort of thing. And there was that part in the match where he had his sort of arm and wrist through the guardrail and he's pulling back on it. And then obviously there was the sort of finish of the match where he had him in the armbar. So I think that kind of does reflect well that the story that they wanted to tell going into the match, actually, statistically, on paper, is the story that you can see, with that time that he spent in the submission. And that was kind of Moxley's main stat. Well, the strikes, but it's certainly one of the main stats. So I do think it's interesting that they've managed to physically create the story that they were verbally telling.
Yeah, I mean, looking at this originally, when I was, just looking at it at face value, I was sort of like, man, Brian Cage, he's not getting a lot of offense. He's definitely getting a lot of those strike downs, which is we sort of talked about earlier about being so important, even though it's 5-3 though. Getting those grapples in as well. I was sort of thinking like, man, maybe if Taz didn't throw in the towel, maybe Cage could have had it. But there's something that has to go into that whole ideology. Go into. Look at that flow of offense tide changes. You slowly see Moxley, getting it into his favor as time progresses, and that perfect, beautiful X in the middle of that 5-minute period chart. Like there is something to say that like Taz was just definitely preserving his asset, I guess would be a phrase. Moxley was tearing him down. I mean, potentially quite literally, with all those arm bars and whatnot. So it is nice to see that, like, if the match continued, I don't know, maybe Brian Cage in that 5-minute period, he was sort of coming back into it. So if the match continued, maybe Brian Cage could have, had it back. But at the same time, it's like you risk injury for Brian Cage because Moxley's out for the arm. But then, of course, as we all know, Moxley is seemingly, I don't want to say immune to damage, but like just absorbs damage. So whatever Brian Cage could have done may not even been enough for Moxley in the first place.
That's the other thing that I found interesting about this. So Moxley took the offense percentage. He got the most offense in, which is the opposite of the pattern with him to begin with. If you remember a few weeks back when we were discussing Moxley as almost he just absorbs everything that his opponent has and then kind of strikes whenever he has the opportunity. Whereas now he didn't take that kind of tactic with Brody Lee. He got the offense and percentage advantage in that match, which was kind of the initial time that we went, oh, that's against the grain with Moxley. Mm-hmm. And then here in this match, he's done it again quite significantly. And his average match offense percentage across his 13 matches is now up to 49%. So he's almost kind of changed tacks now. He's dominating he's dominating more when he's against big men. I don't know if it's because he feels he can't give them that much offense because they can damage him, or if he's kind of going back to a bit more NJPW Moxley, where he's kind of using his strategies a bit better. I suppose storyline wise, you could suggest that at the beginning of the year when these stats started getting gathered, he had one eye, he was up against the inner circle, and maybe now he's rested up, he's had a bit more time to sort his body out, and he's able to kind of be more physically dominant in these matches as well as winning. So perhaps, moving forward, the stats are suggesting that Moxley is growing into somewhat of a more dominant champion that wins as well, which arguably is quite a frightening proposition.
Yeah, I can sort of see that because when he originally won the title, when he was last year, he was facing a lot of smaller guys. I don't necessarily want to say smaller than him or say he's facing Omega, Pac, Jericho, and obviously the Inner Circle at the beginning of this year, and then he sort of transitions into facing a lot of big men. We got Hager, we got Cage, we got Brody Lee, Mr. Brody Lee. Sorry. And there's the idea that if he takes too much offense, he might get overwhelmed by these bigger guys, which I think is a good tactic kayfabe wise. But then you can also look at the fact that around the Hager period, he sort of transitions into more of a, I don't want to say more of an MMA style, but he at the very least introduces more chokeholds or submissions. I would say I would love to see if we can go back later, Craig, on probably another episode to look into like Moxley's submission usage over the time, because I wonder if he is just using more submissions since that Hager match or something. Maybe that match of Fabu Andre was the point where he switched. Always got to shout out Fabu Andre. Rob, any big takeaways you get from this Moxley new Moxley as a dominant champion? What do you sort of feel about that?
Well, one thing that just struck me as kind of interesting, and it's going to be relevant going forward. If he was wrestling different when he had one eye, are we expecting Rey Mysterio and Seth Rollins? And maybe we can have some analysis on one-eyed guys tend to fight smaller people and use less submissions.
Is it? Do you think it's the depth perception? Like if you only have one eye, when you're trying to grab the arm to put that arm bar in, you might be missing the arm, or you're grabbing it too high, and you don't have the depth perception to play a submission game.
It is interesting, and actually,
that wasn't a serious
comment.
No,
actually, because the wrestler Crazy Steve from Impact.
I'm so excited for this comparison.
Well, no, because he has extremely poor vision. I think he might even be legally blind, and he doesn't do a lot of punches because he's probably going to land them if he tries.
Yeah.
But he actually well, this is what he said. I don't know if the stats would bear it out, but he said that he tries to do a lot more, grapples and holds and stuff because he doesn't want to take the risk of sort of, legitimately punching someone. No. So I do find it interesting that maybe that would be the logic of someone who has that going against them, so that they account for it. But if you're a legitimate fighter, you're probably the other way around. You're probably thinking, I can't see very well, I've got to sort of lash out. So it probably does play into strikes. So even though that's the opposite, it kind of does make sense that is what you do, because it's kind of easier to try and hit a target than it is to try and grab a target.
Yeah, I suppose what you're saying with Crazy Steve makes sense though, because it sounds like he's being guided by touch rather than sight. Like you can grapples and submission, you can that's can be touch driven as well as sight driven. So that's really interesting. It makes a lot of sense.
But the Crazy Steve's doing that to try and protect his opponent, whereas
exactly.
Obviously here in Moxley and whatever, perhaps he's trying to damage his opponent. So then you'd expect the opposite, which is kind of maybe what we saw.
Yeah, that's really interesting. On another note, I was listening to a What Culture podcast. I think it was Michael Hamflett was saying that he hopes that when Seth Rollins gets his eye taken out, he sells that by having no depth perception in his matches, and tries to do the curb stomp, but keeps missing because he's got no depth perception, which I really love the idea of as a storyline.
I think the important thing in wrestling, regardless of what it is that pushing, if something's damaged, you've got to make it believable that it is. Oftentimes you get, they go into a match with a with an injury, but then they're completely fine. It worked. It worked for Kane when he just stomps his leg in the ground and it's fine again. But that's because he's a monster.
Yeah.
It shouldn't work for everyone else.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and that's kind of one of the, I suppose, more kind of more famous kind of criticisms that are often levied at wrestlers that quote unquote can't work.
Yeah, just to say real quickly, Crazy Steve is legally blind as a result of a congenial bilateral cataracts. Apparently, he got cataract surgery. He got his cataracts removed, I guess.
Okay.
But his vision was not improved by the cataract surgical removal. So that's I feel bad for him, but he is obviously still doing a good job going back at Impact. Still
But
wrestling.
blindness is really interesting though, because I taught a boy that was legally blind, and he like couldn't see the color blue, and he only had a certain percentage of his vision, but he was an incredible football player. And like you would think that if somebody was legally blind, football would be like the hardest sport in the world because you'd be crashing into people, etc., etc. But no, he was amazing. As a random side note.
Well, it's funny how sort of your other senses sort of step in and step up. But I don't know. I can't imagine how that would happen with football. But
yeah, no, I don't get it either. It was very confusing.
He can feel the ball rumbling on the ground, so he can sort of.
Yeah, but it's like football gets quite congested, and there are a lot of people around, but he never. He would struggle to to see people that are far away to pass to, but like he didn't like run into people or stuff like that.
Okay. Well, I mean, I gotta ask: was he the best kid on the team? I mean, was he this prime player?
Kind of, yeah. He was, but he was kind of he was a ridiculous athlete. He was like really fast and powerful for his age. But yeah, I suppose he kind of was.
That's awesome. That's awesome. You love to hear a story like that. Yeah, I think there is something to like the blindness angle. I kind of like as an idea of like motivating Moxley to use more grapples and submissions. Like there's sort of an idea into that, as opposed to just striking down his opponents. Let's move on to the next segment. Rob, you had obviously you're a stats guy. Obviously you're an analytics guy. You come from the world of stats, as it were, as you said, as a profession. But you said that you wanted to go and look through a lot of the stats that Craig has sort of prepared, and you found some interesting ideas. One, I guess maybe you wanted to also test out a couple theories that you had. Do you want to sort of talk about some of the things that you sort of discovered?
Yes, I thought it'd be quite nice to maybe do some different stats. Because there's quite a few bits that you guys have looked at in previous episodes. But I thought, having a stats background, it might be nice to just introduce a couple of different concepts.
Yeah, you're my teacher. I want to learn everything you got. I mean, Craig is my friend teacher, but you're my professional teacher.
It's funny though, because I have people that are that I just look at their stats ability and think, so it's trickling downhill. It's I'll paying it forward or whatever, But the first one that I looked at is something called the wisdom of crowds.
Okay. What is that?
So the idea of this is that if you were to ask someone to guess something, and even if it's kind of an educated guess, they might not be that good at guessing an exact answer. But if you get lots of people who can have an educated guess to guess the same thing, then on average, you're probably going to get very close to the correct answer.
Okay.
So one of the sort of earliest examples of this, there was a Victorian polymath called Francis Galton who set up an experiment at a village fair to try and guess people to guess the weight of a bull. So nobody got the weight of the bull correct individually, but he had 1,000 people guess, and they got it within 1% of the actual weight, because it all the overestimations cancelled out the underestimations. So I just thought I'd try that on wrestling Twitter. So I put out a tweet saying, guess how many was the average amount of strikes for an AEW match, which obviously you guys have sort of collated the data. So we had that answer already, so we knew that that was roughly about 37. I put out the tweet originally, and I think people originally, when I first put it out, thought I was joking, so they're coming back with like 1 billion and stuff. So I put one out asking for sensible guesses, and then we still had some people who were guessing in the trillions or whatever, so I've excluded those. But
To be fair, they thought you meant New Japan Wrestling, not AEW wrestling.
Yeah, they thought I meant Suzuki, didn't they?
Yeah.
Suzuki. Yeah, but yeah. So, and if you see through time on this graph, we've got the number of guesses going along from the first guess up to the 31st guess, and that was just because after 3 hours, I thought, right, I'll make a graph. There have been some more come in afterwards that I've kind of lost track of where I got up to. So, but I think it would probably still, average out. So you can see that we have one guess that came in about 8th, where they pretty much got bang on the 37. So that was very good, but none of the other guesses got it right. But you can see we've got a line there, the red dotted line is the actual guess, and then we've got the community guesses, which is the black dotted line above it.
Oh my
so
God.
on average, it's almost on top of it. So even though you've got some people guessing zero, some people which you've got this reputation in AEW that it's all flips and dives and stuff. So maybe if people are thinking, well, it's not sort of traditional, hostile wrestling, I don't watch it, but I think it's all, the flips and whatever. So I'm going to assume it's none. And then you've got other people thinking, you've got they've probably seen the Brian Cage, John Moxley match and thought, well, there was a lot of strikes in that. That's probably 200 because. I mean, I tried to count the strikes in that match and gave up after 14, so I've got no idea how you do it, Craig.
It is just one of those things. It is just practice. I can remember finding it difficult when I first started, and now it's just not, and it's just practice, I suppose, like anything else.
I did used to watch matches counting the number of moves that would have been legal in the original World of Sport in modern WWE, and you only get to about 2 in an average WWF match. But so what you see is that the community average sits almost exactly on the actual average, so it shows that you're offsetting all the overestimations with their underestimations. So it's worked out really nicely to sort of demonstrate that theory.
To answer, because I imagine some people are probably thinking this at home. What in everyday reality? Obviously, we're not going around guessing bulls every day. But how is this sort of wisdom of crowd sort of idea? How is that used in like an everyday world?
Well, I mean, there's certainly sites that will do it for gambling. So they'll have a set of the 10,000 people who are obsessed with NFL or whatever, and they will all guess what the result's going to be. It might be difficult if you're actually trying to guess is Dallas going to score this many points versus Philadelphia or whatever.
It affects the odds though, doesn't it? Well, like if lots of people start putting a bet on, don't betting companies then change their odds, because if crowds are thinking that something's going to happen, then there's more of a chance that it will happen, probably because of the idea that, like the wisdom of crowds idea.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly do offset for that. But what they can do is they can bet as a community rather than individuals. Okay. But what sports like American football and cricket and basketball are good at is there's the sort of the spread difference. So what's the difference between the scores? So it's probably quite easy to do your wisdom of crowds with that, because you'll have people thinking, oh well, it's gonna be 10 points, 20 points, 30 points. It averages out at 20. So there's definitely sort of real world applications for it.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, when I saw this graph, I was amazed how I never heard of wisdom of crowds before. Obviously, I've heard of guessing for things, but I've never heard this idea, and just seeing that, seeing 31 guesses, and obviously who knows if add 10, 15, 20 more guesses, if it got I want to say even more accurate, but pretty much they already nailed the number on the head. Yeah, it's just amazing to see that, like, just like what the whole idea is. Like, it's amazing to see, like, just people guess anywhere between 0 to 100, and somehow it gets so close to the actual number. I'm so amazed by this number.
Yeah, and you would hope that with any set of data, the more data you have, the more reliable the results are going to be. So it's really great that we got there at 30, but you'd think, well, possibly won't get there at 30, but once you get into 1,000, 10,000, you're pretty much guaranteeing you're going to get.
I love it. I love it. You have other stuff that you wanted to look at. You started looking at. I think you started looking at, like, what, taunts or something, and how it compares and how that could potentially bring victories or whatnot. I want you to explain it properly, but I can't do it justice. But you had something here compared, talking about Bayes' theorem.
Yeah, so there's loads of the things in your data set, and everything that we've gone through in the previous match. And I had the idea of sort of going through and just finding something that was predictive. But what I really wanted to do was find something where we had someone who had a good sort of winning record, and compare that to, but that same person also be, highly ranked in one of the areas. So I noticed, and I think from memory, it was Brian Cage had sort of a lot of taunts and a great win record, if I remember rightly. It might not have been, but that's kind of by the by. But that's sort of a do we have it on this one here? Maybe it was. Maybe I'm thinking of.
It might have been Wardlow.
Yes, possibly Wardlow. Somebody big.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Somebody big, somebody scary that taunts a lot.
But actually, this is one of the advantages of sort of stats, is that we can sort of strip out who was doing it and look at the underlying numbers, and then it'll give us a trend, and then we apply it back, and that'll be able to, tell us what those people would do if we know the characteristics. So you sort of, you're stripping out who the person is, and then sort of doing the stats based on that. I looked at the top 9 of people with taunts, just because there were 45, so 5 of 45 and 9th, it's a really, really nice number. So the probability of being in the top 5, the top 9th is the 1.1 recurring. And then I looked at the probability of winning. So this was the whole male data set as a whole. You compare the number of wins to the total matches, so you get the probability of winning.
The male singles one-on-one matches.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So I don't know if there's some exclusions or whatever. But then we looked at sort of conditional probability. So the probability of being in that top 9th, but also of winning. So you just take the top 9th, and then you take the number of matches and the number of wins. So you've got a probability. But what we want to test is the probability of being in the top 9th and winning the same as the probability of winning and being in the top 9th? So they might not necessarily be the same thing.
Okay.
Could you say that again, please? I think I almost understand.
Can you explain it like we're 5?
Right. So
just that top 9th bit, like the top 9th and winning in top 9th.
Yeah. So if we had someone that won a match, let's say, for argument's sake, a miracle happens and Peter Avalon wins his first match, is it then, just because he's won a match, does that mean he's in the top 9th of Taunts?
Okay, yeah.
Or, spin it on its head, if Peter Avalon happened to be in the top 9th of Taunts, does that mean that it's probable that he's going to win a match? So there's 2 sort of different things there.
So the question is, should Peter Avalon start taunting a lot to help break his losing streak?
Well, but this is what we need to find out, because Peter Avalon might look and say, well, a lot of the people who win are doing a lot of taunts.
Yeah.
But then we need to test, is it the taunts that's helping him win? Or, is it something else? So it's so with this we can see that you're more likely to win and to be in the top 9 of taunts than you are to be in the top 9 of taunts and win.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, and there's quite a good relation. I mean, you're still pretty likely to win a match if you're in the top 9 of taunts, but you're more likely to be in the top 9 of taunts if you win a match.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So that would suggest that wins lead to confidence, which lead to taunts.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So it's the wins that are driving the taunts rather than the
Yeah.
taunts that are driving the wins.
Oh,
If that makes
interesting.
sense.
That's huge.
Although,
I would say that's huge. Yeah.
That's that's fascinating.
yeah, and
Which from a booking point of view would suggest that wrestlers feel that they should taunt if they're winning.
well, I mean, one of the things that you do when you're sort of looking, if you were trying to do this for business use, and someone came from one department that you have no idea what they do, sort of thing, but they've got the numbers and they want to sort of use it in the business. So you can look at the numbers, but then you've got to say, well, does that actually make sense? In your industry, what you're doing.
Yeah.
And if you were talking to a wrestling fan, they might say, well, I know that every time a wrestler's about to do the finisher, whether they win the match or not, they'll do the little taunt. So Randy Orton will go to that place where his voice is, that kind of thing, before he does the RKO. So then it's no one ever kicks out of the RKO, therefore I know there's always a taunt before a win. And so that kind of makes sense, without looking at the numbers, just from sort of the feeling point of view.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like this a lot. I really like this deep dive. Well, let's keep the deep dive going. Going back into a segment that we used to do, we put on the back burner a little bit, Craig. We're wanting to look at the relationship between taunt rates and win-loss records. And he pulled up another graph here, and to go along with that same idea, Rob, there is a positive, semi-positive correlation here. That the more wins or the more taunts you have, the more wins you got. To say it bluntly in a way. Craig, do you want to talk about this graph?
Yeah, this is just the correlations that we've been doing before, the relationship between taunt rates and win-loss records. So taunt rate means the amount of taunts that a wrestler on average would do for if they competed in an hour of wrestling. So for some of them, it's their total divided down to get it to an hour, and for some of them, it's their total times up to make it an hour. The reason that it's done by per hour, which might seem a bit odd, is because if you do it per match, you've got like Brian Cage, who's winning matches in 2 minutes, and then you've got Cody, who tends to wrestle for 20 minutes. So like 4 matches for those two could be like 4 minutes versus 80 minutes. You need to level it out by time. Looking at this, we've got Cody and Moxley, again, kind of up there in the upper echelons in terms of win-loss. What's interesting about them is they're kind of just below average, just by looking at this by sight for taunts. But then when we're looking at the guys that are using lots and lots of taunts, Archer, Wardlow, MJF, Colt Cabana, Luther, Sammy Guevara, and Ricky Starks, they tend to at least have evens records. All but one of them have better than evens. So the correlation makes sense in terms of when you just look at the chart with your eyes. And then those that have negative win-loss records tend to have kind of below average or just about average taunt rates. So it does seem to be something that is tending towards being a correlation, which does make sense when you think about psychology and how you would present a winner and that kind of idea.
Yeah, Rob, how does this sort of, we talked about that Bayes theorem in the last sort of slide there. How does this sort of idea compare to, this relationship graph we had in front of us?
Well, I mean, one of the things with this graph, we can see the R squared on there, and R squared gives you an indication of sort of how predictive a variable is. So the closer that is to 1, the more predictive it is, although sometimes you wouldn't want it to necessarily be exactly one because there can be sort of problems with that. So it's showing that it's not a massively predictive variable. So there could be. So when we were looking at it before, even though it was more likely to, with the Bayes theorem, to get in the top 9% if you'd won a match rather than the other way around, it was still quite. There was still quite a big relationship between winning a match and being in the top 9% of taunts. So what ideally you'd do, if you were building a model and doing it properly on like I've done on the next slide, what ideally you'd want to do is look at that variable and sort of say, well, is there sort of linear relationship? So does it get more predictive from the bottom ninth to the top ninth, and is it going in sequence? And if it is sort of a linear relationship, then you can assign points to each of those buckets and sort of weight it. So what it's sort of suggesting is that if you're going to use this variable, maybe just not use it on its own, maybe sort of put something in with it, if that makes sense. Probably just blown your minds there.
I think it was on a delay because I was still processing confirmation, but yep, mind blown.
Yeah. What do you mean by putting something else in with it?
Well, either either you could have a model that looked at several variables, so it might say,
okay,
right, well, taunts and strike downs and grapples are my 3 most predictive, and then if I use a combination of those, I can do that. Or you could do sort of build a scorecard, and if you were doing that, then you'd have sort of a band for each of your 1/9, your 1/9, your 2/9, 3/9, 4/9, whatever, and you could do something called weights of evidence that would allow you to assign points to each of those bands within that. So effectively, it would give you more of a weighting for people in different buckets. So there's various different options of doing it, but it doesn't necessarily. It doesn't. We clearly know there is some kind of relationship. The just linear relationship isn't as good as we'd expect. So either you think, well, it's not a great variable, we'll move on, or you dig down and find a different way of using it.
Okay.
Yeah, it does feel like the sort of like X factor that we're sort of discussing is like the level of confidence of a certain wrestler. Like there are the people, or maybe confidence, or for in some cases maybe like a Luther over here, a disillusioned confidence about winning and whatnot. Is that there is that idea of like that the wins brings confidence, which brings taunts. When you have people like MGF and Archer and Wardlow, who bring these wins, so they are leading the pack in taunts because they feel uber. I mean, look at MGF; he's undefeated, uber confident in that sort of regard.
Yeah, and that is a really important thing to think about, because sometimes a variable can be a proxy for something else. So we've got taunts, but it might not actually be taunts. We might need to have a metric for confidence because it might, a lot of your high taunts might be high confidence, and it might actually be confidence that is what we want into model rather than taunts.
Yeah, I wonder if in that, like, kind of digging down into like psychology there, quite, if you think about like the kind of the Superman pose idea, where if you're having an interview, you do like a strong pose in front of a mirror, and that kind of idea, the kind of fake it till you make it idea, which has a lot of kind of psychological value. I suppose where taunts come in, you could be saying to a wrestler like Cutler, Janela, Ortiz, you need to start behaving a bit more confidently. You need to start taunting in the ring a bit more. And the act of doing the taunts might convince that wrestler that in fact they are confident. And that's the thing that might improve storyline, of course, might improve their wrestling ability.
Yeah, I mean, I like that as like,
Maybe a bit of a long shot there, but yeah.
no, I like it a lot. You and I have discussed in the past that we need to start calling up Brandon Cutler and giving him some pointers. Like
Yeah.
there is, I mean, and not just that. There's also that like you said, that booking idea of like, hey, Brandon Cutler. Based on what we see, obviously, there is this that we can sort of figure out this idea that like wins give you confidence, would give you taunts. Maybe there is some sort of psychological idea like what if we look at it the reverse way, where if you just fake confidence, maybe that can lead to wins in a way, where feign confidence, I should say, when Cutler, because Cutler's all the way here at the gosh dang essentially bottom. I mean, it's pretty bad for Cutler, and he's consistently at the bottom of all these numbers, obviously,
Yeah.
with not winning a single match in singles competition. But yeah, and it's also looking on the other end, there is also people that like I said, in terms of that confidence pull, people that kind of like surprise me. I mean, MJF is not surprising. Archer, not really surprising. Wardlow, not really. I mean, kind of surprising. But then you got people like Luther who are up here. You have people like Colt Cabana, which I is kind of surprising because I was looking at this sort of bubble at the beginning where you have Jericho, Phoenix, Guevara, Starks, Luther, MJF, Archer, Wardlow. That is a big group of heels right there. And then you just got Colt Cabana up there as well. I just found that very interesting.
Yeah, he does a lot of comedy-based comedy-ish taunting, if you know what I mean.
Oh yeah, no, I and I think that makes sense. Like fits in line with his character, but it also there is that same idea where, I mean, even though he is zero on this win-loss record thing, he obviously, that does mean that he's not completely losing. It doesn't mean he's completely winning, but there is something to say that Colt does a lot of the comedy shtick because he's confident in his wrestling skill. He is someone that I believe has been said that he grew up watching World of Sport as well. He's someone that used to do a lot of those like camps around England. Like
Right.
he is someone that is, and he's obviously someone that has been around the globe in wrestling. So he knows a lot. He's very well trained. He's essentially an independent wrestling legend. He is uber confident, and so that idea of like, well, he's not, maybe there's something, I think with Colt at the very least, there's something maybe other lacking that maybe not giving him an abundance amount of wins, but at the very least he's got the confidence to support it.
I think I mean these things are all like, I suppose we're kind of talking psychology now. These things are very nuanced. Like people use different behaviors for different reasons. There's the idea that people that are nervous makes a lot of jokes to mask it. If Colt Cabana is having a crisis of confidence, which the Dark Order story suggests, then maybe is now using taunts to mask his lack of confidence.
Great point. Didn't even think of it like that. That is a great point. Yeah, no, yeah, and yeah, and like you said, it's a matter of what works best or at the very end, what doesn't work as well for individual superstars. Obviously, you have, like we talked about, Moxley and Cody, whatever they're doing is working for them, and what that sort of feels like they're doing is being an all-around wrestler. People like Wardlow, obviously, and MJF, obviously, they're doing something right. People like Cutler, who's consistently at the bottom, obviously needs to change it up. Potentially, I guess he's becoming a tag team wrestler with Peter Avalon. But let's move into the next point, Rob. You had another, you sort of mentioned this model earlier. You sort of wanted to look at the actual taunt model versus a modeled win percentage. You want to talk about this, Rob?
Yeah, so the different one of the difference between this and the previous graph is I've looked at the percentage of wins rather than, because with win-loss, you sort of, if you've won 14 and lost 4, you're on 10. So I wanted to sort of get it where it was kind of, we could get everyone on the same playing field essentially. So because if you'd won 10 and lost none, you can look like the same person who's won 14 and lost 4. So if you've got win percentage, everyone's sort of on the same thing. And I did a very simple model in Excel using the data regression function. And one of the interesting things about this is if you look at the orange and the blue dots, they actually average out the same number. So what's that saying is if we didn't really care about picking the individual. We just wanted to pick the trend as a whole. We can do that very well.
Mm-hmm.
But you can see that there's very few dots that actually sort of sit on top of each other. So you've got a few like Orange Cassidy and QT Marshall and Luther and Dustin Rhodes that are pretty much bang on top of each other.
Mm-hmm.
But everyone else, there's more of a spread. And what this model that I quickly threw together doesn't do very well is it focuses in the middle, so it isn't capturing the people that are losing all the matches, like Santana and Ortiz, and it isn't capturing, your Wardlows and Kenny Omegas and Cody Rhodes that are winning high percentages of the matches.
Mm-hmm.
So, you can definitely use Taunt, but probably what it's suggesting is that you would either need something else, or you'd need to do it in a more nuanced way to capture, to more accurately predict the individual results rather than just the collective, if that makes sense.
I believe so. I believe. I say I believe so because I mean I've said before in a previous episode, like I said today, like you are. I love the knowledge that you bring, but I know that I'm still learning. So I'm learning all of this as we're sort of talking about it and trying to soak it all in, folks. So I'm just sort of like I'm slowly trying to pick up what you're putting down, Rob.
I think what's interesting, and I think Rob, you alluded to it at the start when you were talking about your interest in numbers, and like numbers come easier to you rather than words. I suppose when I look at these things, I try to tell a story with it, whereas I think you're more like pure kind of looking at trying to use it as evidence, if I'm understanding correctly. And it's just quite interesting. Obviously, this is your job, whereas I'm a rank amateur that likes football manager statistics. And it's, I think the probably the contrast in perspectives probably fits the like the episode or the kind of the subjects quite well.
Yeah, and I think you've got to sort of have that relatability to say, well, yeah, this is the model, but I want to be able to tell this, this is why it's important, this is the story it's going to tell. So it is really important that you look for those kind of things and say, well, I've done this statistic, but this is kind of why it matters in the real world. That is a incredibly important part of it, which is, sort of the stories that you're telling on the podcast.
Yeah, trying to.
Yeah, I'm just trying to learn while we're all sitting here. I'm just trying to get it all in, soak it all in. I'm not an amateur. I'm not a professional. I'm just a guy that likes charts.
Don't we all?
They're colorful, guys. They got colors. They got names. They got cool little dotted lines. That they got all the cool things in the world. What can I say? I don't want to dismiss what you guys do, all the experience that you guys bring to the table, but I like the charts, baby.
I do know a guy that tries to organise a graph of the year competition, and
really?
Invariably, he's the only person that enters, and then he gives himself a little certificate. So.
Oh well, that's BS. That's just straight up BS. There. I mean, you can't do a. If you're going to run a competition, you can't include yourself in the competition.
Yeah, but the trouble is, he sort of sidles up to you, going, "Look at this graph I've created. It's the best graph you'll ever see. Do you want to enter the competition?" And you're like, "Well, I know that graph's a good graph, so." I think that.
Oh my God. Well then. Well, thank you, Rob, for coming on to this episode of Wrestling of Statistics. We love, obviously you have a wealth of knowledge, and we loved having you on this episode, of course. Of course, as always, we'd love to have you back.
No, it was great. I've really enjoyed it. Any excuse to talk about wrestling or statistics and getting the both in, and the odd mention of Huddersfield Town. It's perfection for me. So.
Yeah, you have a wonderful wealth of knowledge that I can't wait to pry into when I have many more questions for you down the line. But until then, where can people find you?
Just on Twitter at UTTRob. One of the things that I will say, a lot of people say, "Oh, go follow me." I do try my absolute hardest to follow people back, as long as the content is something that wouldn't get me sacked or thrown into prison if someone actually saw me looking at it on the phone. So if you've got a vaguely respectable account, I'll be more than happy to follow you back.
Well, thank you so much, Rob, for being on this episode. I love the talk at the end. Thank you so much. Of course, we'll love to have you back. Everyone, you can go follow him on Twitter at UTTRob. Craig, anything for you to plug?
Please check out the Pro Wrestling Musings website. Over the weekend, there's going to be an AEW Power Rankings by Griff from GA Sports, which should be an excellent piece of work. He's an actual proper journalist, so can write in full sentences using punctuation correctly, which is not always true of myself. So that'll be really good. And then Nathan and Dan should be putting up match reviews for the Brian Cage match from AEW and the Io Shirai match from NXT, which will include a bit of analysis on the kind of body parts kind of analysis of where moves affected and stuff that I had up on Twitter the other day. So that should be something different in terms of different ways to collect statistics.
Yeah, that's something I really enjoyed you doing, Craig. Obviously, like you said, it's a lot more work to be able to track those specific body parts as well. But I feel like
there's a lot of like skipping back to be like, is that hit her face, body kind of thing? But yeah, it was. I was quite pleased with the result. It was quite a. It comes from the old SmackDown versus Raw games, and you'd have your character would get like yellow, orange, red body parts depending on how much they'd been hit.
Yeah, no, I like it a lot. I think if you save it for like the big time matches, save it for your Kingdoms or Manias or whatnot. I think it'd be. I would love to see stuff like that moving forward. But yeah, and of course you can go ahead, Rob.
I was going to say it'd be interesting that because you've had certain wrestlers like Tanahashi's been selling his arm injury for as long as anyone can remember, and maybe he sort of goes into the match with a red arm.
That's a great point. Yeah, like if you did that for Wrestle Kingdom Night 1, you do that for Naito and Okada, you can see going into the match who's been hurt the most and where. It'd be interesting.
Yeah, I couldn't find I couldn't find a tool online that you would allow you to kind of change the colors without it being a quite an overly manipulative like crop, copy and paste, copy and paste, change the color type situation. I suppose if I did that once though, I could reuse it, so that might be worth actually doing.
That's fair. That's a fair point. Well, of course, you can follow Craig on Twitter at CraigPWMusings, or if you just want the analysis of Pro Wrestling Musings, you can follow that at PWMusings. If you enjoyed my nonsense, you can go and follow me at HitTheBooksPod. On this pod, we would greatly enjoy if you my voice crack there. If you can greatly enjoy this podcast, then consider subscribing so that you can get it every Monday when it drops. And of course, we have our brother sister show. I don't know what defines brother sister show, but it doesn't matter, I guess. Gender is nothing. So sister show, you got to hit the books every Friday, which is sort of a realistic fantasy booking podcast that I do with co-host Mikey Manfredi. And you can go subscribe to get both this show and that show as well. Leave a review. I think that's the last thing I want to say. Leave a review so that, if you enjoyed what you heard, leave a review on iTunes. That would greatly help us out. It gets us more listeners and whatnot. All that takes is 2 minutes out of your day to leave a review. We would greatly appreciate it. So thank you so much for everybody. Thank you again to Rob for coming on to this episode. Rob, we loved having you on. I'd love to have you back again one day. So thank you so much. We'll be back next week. Until then, have a good one, everybody. Bye.